Sanibonani Dumelang, good evening and welcome to episode 211 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Khumalo. It's a Tuesday edition of the Private Property Podcast, and as we always do, every single weekday at 7 o'clock, we bring you a hot property topic that helps you better navigate your property journey. Whether you're looking to buy, to sell, to build, you're a property investor or a first-time home buyer, this is the show that you want to make sure you're tuned into every single weekday. Now, this evening's conversation is one that everybody who's probably looking at renovating absolutely needs to, tune into and be, ready to take your notes. I know that with so many of us spending more and more time at home, we've seen different things that we probably want to be doing, whether upgrading our homes in different ways. And we've now been staying at home for nearly a year. So you've probably also maybe found ways to potentially save for some of the projects. Well, this evening, we're going to be looking at 5 tips for getting the most out of your home renovations without overcapitalizing. And we'll even explain what overcapitalizing is, because I'm sure some viewers at home may not quite be aware what that is all about. So if you are looking at renovations and you're looking at different ways you can best manage them, this is the show for you. I know this one is quite an important one. I'm always doing some other renovation or upgrade in any of the properties that I have, and it's one of those things that's so important for me to always bear in mind, because you want to make sure that you don't spend too much money in a property, because should you one day sell, you want to make sure that you haven't spent more money than you're able to get out of your property. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. If you at home have renovated your property, I want to hear what that experience has been like. Were you able to stick to your budget? I know that that's often a very big pressure point with many of us struggling to stay on budget, never mind stay on time. And if you were able to stay on budget, how did you manage to do that? Do share some of those tips with us here on the Private Property Podcast. Now, something that you can look forward to later on this evening is the Farming Podcast with Umbali Nogo. That, of course, comes to your screens every single Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. And you can look forward to the show later on this evening as Umbali tackles another agriculture issue. So if you know that you've got green fingers or want to go into agriculture, then that is the podcast that you never want to miss out on. And on Wednesdays, Esther Claassen brings you the First Time Home Buyers Show, where she profiles people who've walked the journey of buying that first property, and oftentimes have had to overcome certain obstacles. And what she even wants to do is she wants to know from you if you've got a great story about the first property that you bought. And if you do, then do slide into her DMs so that you could potentially be featured on the show. And over the weekend, Chad brings you the Home Shoppers Show. That, of course, is one you can look forward to if you're looking to buy in an estate or a complex. That is a show that you always want to watch, where he gives you a snapshot of some of the amenities that you can expect in those respective estates and complexes. Well, one of the other very exciting things that I know many of you have been keeping track with, of course, is the Sherlock Holmes competition. This is now in its 7th week, and every single Monday we share with you a riddle on our social media pages as well as on our website, that's www.privateproperty.co.za, and we want you to crack the riddle. It's simply that easy. And if you successfully crack it, well, you stand a chance of walking away with a 5,000 Rand voucher every single Friday. And to make sure that we keep things spicy, we've gone a step further, where every Wednesdays and Thursdays we give away a 500 Rand spot cash prize. So you have to make sure that you are watching us live in order to claim that prize. Now we're going to put the riddle for week 7 of the Sherlock Holmes competition up on our screen. And that is: in the sleepy hamlet of McGregor, your idyllic family home awaits. With a garden made of vineyards, there's even an extra space for granny. So if you think you might know where that where the riddle leads you, then do make sure that you go into our website and enter the Sherlock Holmes competition. Well, of course, we absolutely love hearing from you from across our social media pages. So Do keep texting us and engaging us on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, as well as on Twitter. You can also follow myself on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is at @zamantungwa_K. Now, to get us started with this conversation, we are looking at tips for getting the most out of your home renovations without overcapitalizing. And to help us better understand how we can do this, I'm joined this evening by Graeme Steen, who is the COO at kaunda.com. Graeme, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Zamtunga. Thank you so much for having me.
It's only a pleasure, Graeme. I think before we even look at the 5 tips, let's first, tackle the big word in today's conversation. That is, of course, overcapitalizing. What do we mean when we talk about overcapitalizing when it comes to property?
Sure. Yeah. So overcapitalizing is a complicated term for an easy concept. So basically what we're talking about here is when you put money into your home, so when you're spending on any renovations or anything, what you don't want to be doing is putting in more money than you're able to get out at the end, right? So you want to be able to sell your home for a greater value than it is today, plus the money you put in for renovations. So really trying to find kind of a return on assets.
And I guess one of the best ways to look at it, Graeme, is, oftentimes I know a lot of people who want to do flips are very big on understanding the numbers, because that's where you absolutely cannot overcapitalize, because you obviously want to make, your money, not just the cost, but you also want to be able to, charge slightly more. So understanding the numbers of your property and the area, and perhaps even where the property is going, is such an important one. Perhaps just share a few tips of how we should, look at the amount of money we put into our property, because I think that's one of the things where sometimes people don't quite know how much is too much. I mean, if I look at, I'm in the middle of renovating a few properties. If you look at something like a kitchen, I think I got a quote for one of the kitchens, and it's a fairly big kitchen. I think a quote was something like $250,000. I was like, I actually can't put in $250,000 in that specific kitchen, because I will never be able to make it out of it, right? It's such a huge percentage of what the property itself costs. But obviously with other people, maybe you're feeling slightly emotional. You're thinking this is going to be the family home. So how should we be looking at, this is now too much money that you are putting into a property, and you likely won't be able to make it out even if you stay there for the next 10, 15 years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess quickly to justify how I feel I can speak about this. So at Kandua, right, so Kandua.com, we are a marketplace that connects service providers, so people who do your work, your renovators, your plumbers, to customers. So we see thousands of transactions going through every single month. So we get really a good sense in terms of kind of what value is out there, what are people spending on different jobs. And we also talk to real estate agents just to see kind of what the situation is in the market. What's interesting at the moment is, obviously, as you know, interest rates are really low. So it's a great time to look at potentially borrowing money and using that to put it into your home, which is your primary asset. But really talking about kind of what is the right number to put in is a difficult one. What we see generally as a rule of thumb is that you should 10%, up to 10% of the value of your property for renovations is really a good number to aim for. Obviously, it's a rule of thumb, right? So just like you, I'm actually renovating my home at the moment. So you kind of use that 10%, and then you say, okay, well, is it 10%? If not, how do I justify it, right? And what you then do is you go and you look around at properties within your area, and if you are 40% below market, then maybe you probably have a little bit more wiggle room, but you really need to be able to justify that 10%, because most of the time if you're spending over that, you probably are in high danger of overcapitalizing. But that being said, and apologies for a long answer here, what you mentioned there was, if you're just doing it for lifestyle, like if I really want a nice kitchen and I'm going to live in my house for the next 10 years, then overcapitalization is less of an issue. And it's more about, am I spending something that I'm going to enjoy for the next 10 years?
And that's actually such an important distinction, Graeme, because as you were saying, 10% is a rule of thumb that you can almost try to use. A part of me was thinking, if I look at a 1 million rand home, 100K doesn't actually go that far in terms of renovations. I mean, especially if you're looking at doing a kitchen, almost any good kitchen sets you back at least nearly like 80, 90K, right? If you're sort of redoing it completely, maybe even getting new appliances. So it really does have to, as you're saying, you almost need to look at, is this your family home, your primary home, where you know you're not going to think about drawing and selling that particular property, or is this an investment property where you know it's about the margins, the rental, and even the maintenance and upgrades that you're doing are essentially trying to make sure that it's a property that will also attract a certain type of tenant, and you're still able to get the desired yield that you essentially want. Well, I guess, Graeme, then what would then be the first tip for our viewers at home that can help them, not overcapitalize? Because I'm sure some are thinking, oh my word. I mean, and the reality of the show is many people who have their primary residence and also, of course, your investment properties. And so we wear these different hats with different renovations. And so when we're then now looking at whether it's the investment property or even perhaps your primary residence, because I think even though you know with your primary resident that you might stay there for a long period of time, you obviously also don't want to go overboard. You still want to exercise some financial prudence even as you're doing those particular upgrades. So for our viewers at home, then, what is the first tip when it comes to ensuring that they don't overcapitalize on their properties?
Sure. So I think the first tip, and it's quite intuitive. So if you've done the maths and you're comfortable that you're kind of in the right spend range, I think the first tip, not overcapitalizing, is really about making sure you get good work, right? And that's about hiring the right contractor. This is probably the first tip. And if there's one thing that viewers remember, it's about how do you find the right contractor who's ultimately going to be able to realize your vision, right? Because you have a vision in terms of, this is the renovation I want to do. This is the reason I want to do the renovation and the value it's going to add. So how do I find a contractor who is, one, will do quality work, and two, is someone who is actually going to be aligned with what I want to produce. Again, kind of that's within Kandua, that's kind of part of why we exist, is that we take these contractors, they live within our marketplace with hundreds of reviews, hundreds of thousands of reviews, photos, and all of that. So you can actually go and look at different contractors and evaluate them and say, this one, if I look at the photos of the work they've done previously, they are someone who's aligned with what I would like to realize. And if I look at the reviews they have, they actually do good work. So that's the first one, is like, get the right contractor in, because otherwise you're not going to be producing what's in your mind, what you've designed.
And I think the big thing with that one, Graeme, we take it for granted, is sometimes the cheapest option is not necessarily the best option. I think oftentimes we're very price conscious, especially now in times of COVID, as we should be. I think there's nothing wrong with being price conscious, but the reality is also that the contractor that comes in at the lowest figure isn't necessarily the one that will give you the best work. So you almost need to interrogate that price point further, especially if they're substantially lower than other contractors that you're comparing them with, because you do tend to find that some people think, I'll save a couple of thousands in terms of paying for the labor cost, and that ends up costing you so much money further down the line. So I love that tip, because we like saying to people, get quality people on your team, and contractors is usually such a big pain point for so many viewers at home. I know they've shared some of their stories. I've shared some of my sort of horror stories with some contractors that I've had. So now that we've probably gone on calendar.com and we found the right contractor, we've sussed out the work that they do, and we're happy with choosing a particular contractor, what then is the second thing that we should be mindful of when we want to make sure we don't overcapitalize?
I think the second thing is, so if you're doing this as an investment property, and it sounds like you really know where you need to invest, is investing in the right things, right? The right renovations. So, for example, what we see through Kandua, where you're going to get your biggest bang for buck, is often in your kitchen renovations and your bathroom renovations, right? You know that I spend money there, I'm probably going to get it back. You potentially can also start, especially kind of in the world that we live in, you can start looking at kind of green investments, like if anything where you're going solar or anything like that, where you're likely to get a return or make your property more attractive. That's a great way to invest and realize a return. On the flip side, because I always get asked this, okay, this is what I invest in, what shouldn't I invest in? Where sometimes you won't see a return is if you get too much customization, right? So if I love these fittings, they're beautiful fittings, but they're really expensive. For me, that's great. For the person I'm going to sell it to, they probably won't value it as much as I will. Or I really want to put in this amazing pattern on this wall. I want to paint it a unique color. Again, great if that's for lifestyle, but that's probably not where you're going to see your highest return if you're really just wanting to put value into your property.
You know, as you were saying that, Graeme, you're actually reminding me of there's a real estate investor in the US, and they're quite big in certain parts of the US, and they have this, I'll say, mantra that they have when it comes to maintaining their investment properties, and they say you must run it like a Honda, right? So you don't want to put rims and all kinds of unnecessary things. It's a nice secondhand car. You want to take care of it, take it for its regular service, make sure that you are, taking good care of it, but you're not unpimp my ride. So it's also so important that in your own sort of property, you don't, especially investment properties. I mean, certain finishes like your matte taps can be so expensive, right? I mean, imagine spending 1.8, 2,000 rands on a tap when you could easily have spent like 300 rands on a tap, only to find that you're not going to be making that money back. And the person who's potentially going to be buying your property is not going to value that this is a 2,000 rand tap when you kind of sort of broke your back trying to find that specific tap. So unless you're dealing with high-end real estate, certain finishes like that are probably not going to get you value for money. People very likely are not going to notice it, and you'd have very likely sort of spent a lot of your money that you're not able to get back. And of course, if you are just joining us right now, I'm in conversation with Graeme Steen, who is a COO at Kaunda.com, and we're looking at tips for getting the most out of your home renovations without overcapitalizing, and understanding, why it's so important for us to be fiscally prudent as much as possible, especially when it comes to our property investments. If you have any questions and comments, do share them down here below. I want to hear from you at home. If you've, recently or previously renovated your property, how do you make sure that you stay within budget, that you don't overcapitalize? I know sometimes it's so easy to go overboard. I know there have been instances where I've done it before, and you kind of have to rein yourself in and remember that this is a business, there's a bottom line, and you must kind of stick to it as much as possible. How are you at home able to do that? We are taking your questions and comments down here below, so do share them through. And before we get to them, Graeme, then what would be the third tip that you'd like to share with our viewers that can help them, ensure that they don't overcapitalize?
Sure. I think this is the third tip I would put in, and I think it's something that keeps everyone who's doing renovations up at night, is really being unrealistic about costs. And there are different ways that can come through, right? So there's kind of the costs that a contractor can foresee and a contractor can't foresee, and I'll break that down. So when a homeowner designs a bathroom or designs anything, right, they're often thinking about what they can see, right? They can see the beautiful fittings, they can see the beautiful wall, but sometimes they don't think about, for example, what's inside the wall, right? The electrical, the plumbing. All of that adds costs. If I break down a wall, someone has to take that rubble and remove it. That's a cost as well. So and the tip I have for that is, and this is why finding the right contractor is so important, is right at the beginning of the relationship, get them to break down an itemized list of all the pieces of work that need to happen, right? You need to know that if there's going to be demolition, there's going to be rubble removal attached. Otherwise, you're just going to have rubble on your property, right? Are they doing the electrical work? Are they doing the plumbing work? And how much is that going to cost me? Because sometimes it's a bigger cost than you expect. The flip side of that, and I guess this one is a little bit more difficult to get upfront from a contractor, but almost expect the unexpected. So when you're doing renovations, unfortunately, it happens where there's damp in the walls, the foundations aren't quite ready for the renovation you're looking to do. So you should always put in a buffer into your budget for unexpected costs. Basically, that's just, yeah.
And I think, Graeme, one of the big things is when you work with really good contractors, they're able to also in your budget say, budget this amount as a potential extra, as opposed to kind of working with somebody who's just wants a quick job. And sometimes a renovation is a small thing, so you don't really need a lot of buffer. But if you know that the nature of your renovation is quite huge, you want to put in that buffer because, as you say, you take down a wall, they will bill you for removing rubble, but they didn't actually itemize it. And that can be quite a big pressure point because when you're going through it, you as a customer probably weren't aware of all these various line items or things that keep popping up. And so the cost can easily go up. And of course, you can't say just leave it because by then, they've stripped down your walls. There's probably dust all over the house. So you need them to finish. And they're not going to finish until, certain material also gets bought and they also get paid. So it is one of those very tricky ones to tend to navigate. And I see there's certainly certain similar sentiments from some of the viewers at home. We've got some questions and comments coming through from Facebook. We've got one coming from one of our top fan gang members, Usemi Mahatso, on Facebook saying, renovations are not easy. At the moment, I'm busy with one house in Soshanguve, turning it into student accommodation. I don't really stick to budget because prices keep going up. I know that that pressure. I think with COVID right now, prices keep going up, supplies, keep changing. Sometimes we'll go to one warehouse, they don't have a particular, product. You go to the next one, they don't. By the time you come back the following week, they'll tell you, a price has now gone up. So that is quite a difficult one. We've got another comment here from Jason De Jong on Facebook. He's saying, what I've seen lately due to the housing price hikes, it's difficult to get a good deal and also upgrade, renovate the house in order to make good equity at a later stage. Jason, I think, Graeme, are you seeing that? Because I think one of the big things with, building equity in a home is a lot of, I'll say, the older property investors will talk about, I'll call it the heydays of when they were able to buy a property at a fairly low price, put X amount into it, and within sometimes even 2 months, sell that property and still make a relatively good, return. Whereas now, some of those deals are also so few and far in between that building up that kind of equity actually does take a bit of time.
Yeah, I do think it's probably a more difficult world in terms of building that up. One thing I would say, and I guess it's slightly self-serving, is that within Kandua, what we see is the prices that our contractors come through at are generally about 30% lower than when you go with, inverted commas, the big guys, which means you have additional 30% to play with in terms of investing into kind of the equity of your home. So that's while it's potentially more difficult than the heydays, as you mentioned, I still think there's a lot of opportunity out there if you are sensible in terms of, one, going through the steps we spoke about, two, using the advantage of the interest rate, and three, finding the best value for money contractors that you can find. I still think there's a lot of opportunity there.
We've got a question here coming from Lucia saying, what I know is that a bathroom does not give the house much value, but the kitchen does. But then again, kitchens are expensive. How do we go about deciding on how to make our homes comfortable? And that's a big one, because as we were saying, kitchens can be so pricey. I think even sometimes when you go for, almost a bare minimum kitchen renovation, you'll find it's still relatively pricey. So how do we balance renovating and keeping, especially kitchen costs, as economical as possible?
Yeah. So I do. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess it's really about. It's difficult. It will be home by home, right? You have to kind of look at each one and say, okay, what is the state of the kitchen? What are the states of the bathrooms? But I do think that there are some small changes that you can make within the kitchen and within bathrooms that will still give you good bang for buck.
Yeah.
Often it's not about, hey, let's renovate the whole kitchen, right? You can change the cabinets in the kitchen, and that can make a huge difference, right? So sometimes I think when people think of renovations, they think, okay, I'm going to tear everything out and I'm going to replace it, and that's going to cost me hundreds of thousands of rands. But potentially there are, inverted commas, smarter ways of going about it that can still get you value. So I think that's the way to look at it, is look at the different rooms in your house and say, okay, what could I do at a minimum that would still give me value?
And that, and I do hope that helps, Alicia, because you really do want to do it bit by bit, especially when you're doing it for your home, because you know that it's for the long term. So you've got a bit of sort of wiggle room and time to take your time with the various renovations. Now, Graeme, what is the fourth tip for viewers at home to make sure that we do not overcapitalize when we do our home renovations?
So I think the fourth tip is less overcapitalization, but linked to cost. And it's an important one, is when you have a contract or when you have any renovations happening on your platform, making sure you have the right insurance in place. Because ultimately that can end up being a big unexpected cost. What I mean by that, and it's again on Kandua, it's something we are very, we take very seriously with all the service providers on our platform, is making sure that they have business liability insurance, right? What business liability insurance is, for those who aren't in the space, really, it's making sure that there's any damage to property, especially if it's your neighbor's property, or heaven forbid, anything happens to personnel on site, your contractor is covered and they're able to cover that cost. Additionally, what you should do as a homeowner, if you're doing a larger renovation, is also just checking in with your insurer to make sure that you're covered, because the risk changes during that renovation. So what you don't want to do is, if something happens, you reach out to your insurer and they say, well, unfortunately, this is not covered by your policy. So it's really just making sure that you have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted when you do that renovation, in case something goes wrong that could potentially cost you a lot of money.
And then, Graeme, what is the final tip for our viewers at home for us to make sure we do not overcapitalize in our respective properties?
So the final tip I have, and it's kind of linked to the first tip, and it's one that's very tempting, is please don't try to do large renovations yourself, DIY. So I know, and it's very attractive. We've all seen these shows on Netflix for extreme home makeover and everything, where we think, oh, well, imagine how much money I can save if I just do all of this myself. Unfortunately, these jobs actually become very complex, especially when you get to plumbing, electrical. And what ends up happening is someone has to come in and unfortunately fix the mess. So you've spent money that hasn't added any value, and you're going to spend more money just to get back to where your starting point, and then you start spending. So that's as a direct route to overcapitalization.
Yeah, you know, when you actually just started saying it, I was laughing in the background, because when you actually begin to think of the million and one things that can go wrong during a renovation, you absolutely do not want to be, doing it yourself. I realize sometimes, there's a renovation on one of the properties where we change, and it's fairly small. We're changing the flooring. Only to find, when we're changing the flooring, that the developer that built this place basically cut costs, and there are certain electrical wires that are running where they shouldn't be running on the floor. Luckily, they found them before they hit set electrical pipes. And so we're able to work nicely around them. They were not affected at all. And so sometimes when you don't know little things like that, you can easily, even get hurt. I mean, never mind the cost factor, you yourself can, get hurt when you're doing a renovation. I think if people want to DIY something, start small. Maybe do a little table, do yourself like a nice little table that you can use, perhaps even a shelf. those are cute DIY projects that you're able to do for yourself. And if anything goes wrong, almost nobody gets hurt. But big renovations, absolutely do not do it. You want a professional who project manage it, who also knows what can go wrong. Because I think that, the benefit of working with experienced people is that they know what can potentially go wrong and they know how to plan for it. You and I probably not so much. So it's so important that I think for viewers at home, we know how to stay in our lane and rather work with the right contractor. Well, Graeme, we're going to leave it there this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And I do hope our viewers at home have certainly learned a thing or two about better managing their properties and making sure that they don't overcapitalize. Thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
And that is Graeme Steen, who's the COO at kaunda.com. And of course, if you want to be able to get a contractor that you can work with, you can go to kaunda.com, where they certainly do have a whole host of various contractors that you're able to work with. And as Graeme has already said, that they're priced quite competitively, so you'll be able to at least have a bit more wiggle room in terms of how you can get more value for your rands. Well, that's it from me, Zamantungwa Khumalo, and the rest of the Private Property Podcast team this evening. But as usual, it's a Tuesday, so I do not leave you alone. Umbali Noko will be up at 8 p.m. with the Farming Podcast. Until then, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Khumutsapoy, and I'm an entrepreneur from Soweto. Soweto's come a long way, from a small township to a mini city of its own. Soweto's got some really, really nice suburbs, like Deep Kloof Extension, but the locals call it Deep Kloof Expensive. Orlando is known as the suburb that had the first brick houses built in Soweto. Orlando Stadium for its iconic games between Kaizer Chiefs and Pirates. And most importantly, Vilakazi Street, where Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu resided. To the west of Soweto, you find suburbs of Dobsonville and Protea. These two suburbs are actually very cosmopolitan, fresh, young, and very new. Right next door to Soweto, we have a neighboring suburb, which is Eldorado Park. For a little adventure and a little fun, Soweto's got so many night spots, from the News Cafe at Mamponya Mall, to your Vilakazi Streets at Kumzi's, to just chilling at Chafpozi just between the towers and having a simple braai vleis chisanyama. Something very close to my heart is actually seeing people move back into Soweto, growing businesses, remodeling homes. It merely says to us that Soweto's a growing city. There's way more to this place than what we think. Soweto needs to be discovered daily. I'm so proud to call Soweto my home, and this is my neighborhood.